With this 13th lecture in our course in the history of Christian theology, we are beginning part 2 of the course, which will take up the next 12 lectures. And we're making a transition in the subject matter as well. We're moving from the ancient church, the church that is located in the late Roman Empire and the time of the church fathers in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, even 6th centuries, and we're moving on to the Middle Ages. We're going to start looking at medieval developments of concepts, ideas, and doctrines that have their roots all the way back in the New Testament, that were developed by the church fathers, but then are developed further and take on new forms and new problems and issues and interests in the medieval period. The doctrine that we will look at in this lecture, that we will see the development of in this lecture, is the doctrine of the incomprehensibility of God. Remember when we were talking about the Trinity, how we mentioned that there's this eternal begetting of the Son by the Father. The Son is eternally begotten of the Father. He originates from the Father, but it's not a process in time. Right? It's a form of origination where Christ comes into being, or rather the eternal Son comes into being, and yet there was never a time when he was not. Right? He comes into being, yet there was never once when he was not. That's a very hard concept to wrap your mind around, and the church fathers after Nicaea ended up insisting that it is in fact incomprehensible. It's an incomprehensible divine begetting of the Son by the Father. That becomes the nucleus of the distinctively Christian doctrine of the incomprehensibility of God. There's an incomprehensible divine begetting at the heart of the divine Trinity, which is the Christian view of God. So at the very heart of God is incomprehensibility, a mystery beyond our understanding. And what we're going to do in this lecture is trace that concept as it goes its way in 2 different directions and then gets mixed up in a way in the Middle Ages. The 2 different directions are east and west. Remember, we've been talking about how the Roman Empire has an eastern and a western half. Think of the Roman Empire situated around the Mediterranean. The eastern half, including Turkey in the north and Egypt in the south and Israel, is Greek-speaking. And that half of the Roman Empire becomes the theological homeland of Eastern Orthodoxy. The Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox churches trace their theological tradition back to the eastern half of the Roman Empire. It's Greek-speaking half. And we talk about the Greek church fathers, people like Athanasius and Gregory of Nazianzen, who spoke Greek. The Nicene Creed was worked on in Greek in the eastern half of the empire. Then there's the western half of the Roman Empire, the part where they speak Latin. That includes Italy, Spain, North Africa, the part of North Africa that includes, say, Algeria and Tunisia, where Augustine worked. And that part of the Roman Empire is the theological homeland of Catholicism and Protestantism, what's called the Western Church. Both Protestants and Catholics derive their theological tradition from this Latin half of the Roman Empire. Now, of course, there's interaction between the two, but there's some important differences in the tradition. The most important being that the Latin Church, the Western Church, has Augustine. They have Augustine, as it were, in their bloodstream, and the Eastern Church doesn't. The Eastern Church has not been deeply influenced by Augustine. The Western Church has been profoundly influenced by Augustine. And that is part of our story in this lecture. Let's go back to that notion of the incomprehensibility of the divine Trinity. The incomprehensibility of God is not a uniquely Christian doctrine. The Trinity is, of course, but the incomprehensibility of God is a philosophical concept which was developed at some length by a great pagan Neoplatonist named Plotinus, a 3rd century pagan Neoplatonist who was a very important figure on the horizon for Christian thinkers as they're working through the way they think about God. Plotinus had thought of the divine. He doesn't actually have a concept of a personal God, but he thinks of the divine, we could say, in 3 parts, or 3 principles, really. In one of his treatises, he even speaks of 3 divine hypostases, using a term that Trinitarian Christians will pay attention to. 3 divine principles or hypostases in a descending order. There's a kind of hierarchy here. First of all is the One, he calls it, then the mind, meaning the divine mind, and then the soul, meaning the world soul, or the soul that is the life of all things, so that all souls have a kind of participation in this divine soul. We're not going to be able to talk much about this divine soul that is at the life of all things. Interesting concept, but it's not a Christian concept. The divine mind, this middle concept, has more of an influence in Christian thinking. It's a deeply Platonist concept. It's related to this notion of intelligibility that we talked about when we discussed Platonism in an earlier lecture. Remember, you're working on the Pythagorean theorem, and then you're not getting it, but you're figuring it out, and then all of a sudden you say, aha, now I see it. That is the activity of the divine mind. It's not a process. The divine mind never figures stuff out, never learns, never grows. That's what we do when we're figuring stuff out. The divine mind is simply that, aha, now I see it. An eternal contemplating of, there's the truth. So the divine mind is full of ideas, it turns out, but that's a technical term in Platonist philosophy. In the history of Western philosophy, no one has ideas except God, except the divine mind, until the 16th century, or rather the 17th century with René Descartes. Prior to that point, the only mind that has ideas is the divine mind, or God, because it's actually a technical term in Platonist philosophy up to that point. It's an eternal, intelligible form or essence, the kind of thing we referred to in that earlier lecture, an eternal form or essence or truth, like, say, the Pythagorean theorem, or like the eternal truth about justice or eternal beauty. And to know these ideas is not to figure them out, but to see them. Aha, now I see it. When you have that aha experience, it's no longer a process. It's just a seeing. You just see it. You just get it. It's a moment in which time touches eternity. And the divine mind is all aha, all seeing the truth. It's pure intellect perceiving intelligible truth. But that's not the highest level. The highest level is where it all begins, the One. The divine mind has many ideas. The One does not. The One has no manyness, no parts. It is simple in the technical sense of having no parts. Think of it as like a geometrical point. A point in geometry has no dimensions, no parts, no length, no width, no depth. But all of geometry, as it were, is generated by this simple, dimensionless point. So that's just a metaphor, but that's how the concept of the One works in Neoplatonism and in Plotinus. The One has no differentiation, no parts, and yet it's the source of all the manyness, including all of geometry, all of logic, all of ethics, indeed, justice, truth, beauty. All that stuff is sort of generated by the One. And indeed, the divine mind is eternally generated by the One. And this is exactly the same vocabulary used in Nicaea, in the Nicene Creed, to talk about the Son being eternally generated or begotten by the Father. The Church Fathers noticed this. The problem is that in Plotinus, the One, when it generates the mind, generates something less than itself. The divine mind is less than the One, precisely because it's generated. The One has no source. The mind has its source in something above it. And it was very natural for Platonists to think about this in this way, this kind of hierarchy. What is generated is lower than what generates it. The source is higher than the thing that comes from it. That's precisely what the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity denied and said, no, the Son is not lower than the Father. Even though his source is the Father, he's equal with the Father. There's no hierarchy here. There's none of this descending scale of being. Whereas in Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, there is this descending scale of being. The mind is less than the One. The intelligible is less than the incomprehensible. Because the simple One is, in fact, incomprehensible. Because it has no manyness, no ideas, no structure, it can't be understood. The mind is precisely all about understanding. The divine mind is understanding, pure understanding, eternal understanding. But the One is above understanding. The One is above intelligibility. The One is above form and idea and essence. The One is a simple and incomprehensible thing above all other things, and the source of all other things. Now, you can see that this is going to pose a very interesting challenge to anybody who wants to think about an eternal God. And the Christian theologians in the Nicene tradition certainly did. So one of the most important questions is, when you think of God as a Christian, when you think of the Trinity, are you thinking of an incomprehensible one or a divine mind? Which is it? Because they do seem to be different concepts of the divine. That's a challenge that the Eastern tradition gave a definite answer to. The Eastern theological tradition, from which we get Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, very clearly identified the Nicene Trinity, the God of the Christians, with the incomprehensible one of Plotinus. Because, after all, the eternal generation of the Son is incomprehensible. The Trinity itself is incomprehensible. That is to say, it's above intelligibility, above understanding, not below it, but above it. It also means that the Trinity is simple. This is interesting. Simple is a technical term. It means it has no parts. You may remember when I discussed the doctrine of the Trinity in our lecture on that topic, I kept emphasizing God does not have parts. God is simple. The Trinity is simple. It has no parts. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but the Father is not part of God. So in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the Trinity is the simple, incomprehensible one. The great theologian who worked this idea out at the most depth is a Greek theologian, a 5th century Greek-speaking theologian named Dionysius. Nowadays he's called Pseudo-Dionysius because he identified himself with a 1st century Dionysius that no one thinks he actually is a 1st century Dionysius. I won't go into those details. He's a Pseudo-Dionysius to modern scholars. He's Dionysius simply to the Eastern Orthodox. In the West, he came to be named Denis, and we get the name Denis from him. Dionysius worked out the notion of the Trinity, the Christian Nicene Trinity, as a simple, incomprehensible one, no parts, and above intelligibility, above all understanding. It's like saying, we have to understand, you see, when you say that God is incomprehensible, above understanding, you're not saying that he's beneath understanding. It's like understanding is like seeing something in the light. And then there's what you can't see because it's too dark. And then there's something else. There's the divine darkness of the incomprehensible God who is dark because he is too bright. Imagine trying to look right straight at the sun, too bright to see, and it darkens your eyesight. You're dazzled. Your eyes are blinded. So there's a divine darkness, says Dionysius, which is like the dazzling brightness of the sun. It is above intelligibility, above light, above understanding, because there's too much to understand. It is, it's like the sun, which is too visible to understand, too visible to see, I should say. Right? Think of the sun as too visible to see. Well, God is too intelligible to be understood, and that's what incomprehensibility amounts to for Dionysius. An incomprehensibility that is like a brightness too bright to see. Well, what do you do to talk about an incomprehensible God? Dionysius picks up on a theme that was already developed in the Eastern Church, and he takes it further, a theme of what's called apophasis or apophatic theology. It comes from a Greek term meaning negation or denial. Dionysius says, when you want to talk about God, the best thing to do most of the time is to say what he is not. God is not material. God is not passible. God is not changeable. God is not in time. You can say a lot of things about what God is not, because God is not like anything else. God is like nothing in the world. So you can look at all sorts of things in the world that you do understand, and even you can look at all sorts of intelligible truths and say, God is not that. So there's a theology of denial, of saying what God is not, called apophatic theology in the Greek Orthodox tradition. The West actually picked up some of this, and in Latin they called it the via negativa, the negative way. Same idea. You describe God by saying what he is not. But Dionysius is actually a very subtle thinker, and he realizes that that's not all you want to say. You do want to say something affirmative about God, and after all, even the negations, the denials, are not an adequate way of talking about God. We have no adequate way of talking about an incomprehensible God. So, yes, we should negate things about God, right? He's not in time. He does not change. He is not limited. He's infinite. Notice how many of the abstract terms we use for God are actually negations. Infinite, impassible, changeless, eternal, really, which means not in time. You can actually find a whole lot of the crucial metaphysical attributes of God really are negations. But, says Dionysus, the negations also are not adequate. So, if affirmations, negations, neither of them are adequate. Both of them are necessary. So we can both make affirmations and negations. And so Dionysus is actually famous for another treatise that he writes called On the Divine Names, which explains crucial terms used to describe God. By the way, names here is another word for nouns. It's a slightly misleading title, slightly misleading translation. On divine names means on divine nouns, like good or goodness, truth, beauty, justice. All of these are nouns that can be used to name or describe God inadequately, because God is not like any goodness or beauty or justice that we know in our experience, but he is the source of all goodness and beauty and justice, just like that one is the source of all the manyness of geometry. So if you think of goodness, beauty, and justice as flowing from this source which is above all goodness, beauty, and justice, but not a negation, not simply a negation, right? Like the sun that's too bright to see, like the good that is too good to be a good that we can recognize and understand. That sort of affirmation. God is the hyper good, we could say, the hyper beauty, the hyper justice. And in fact, Dionysus will say God is hyper essence, or hyperousios is the Greek term. Hyper essence gets translated into Latin as super essence, because not only is he above intelligibility, he's above essence, right? Because the intelligible essences in the mind of God in Plotinus, the intelligible essences are the only essences that are actually the highest essences there are intelligible essences. And being above intelligibility means also being above essence. You can actually say in Pseudo-Dionysus, God is above being, right? He's more than being. He's hyper-being. He's hyper-essential, super-essential. He's the good beyond goodness, the being beyond being, and he's also beyond understanding. And let me mention, on the affirmative side of it again, you get this notion of goodness. God is the good, very Platonic way of speaking of God. Christians like it. God is the supreme good. Dionysus will say God is the good that diffuses itself. Lovely phrase. The self-diffusing good. Again, like the sun, which diffuses light. The sun which is above light because it's too bright to see, but it sheds light everywhere. God is the good that sheds good things everywhere, diffuses good things everywhere, so that the whole universe is good. We mentioned that with Augustine. Dionysus fully agrees. The universe is good because it all is an outflowing from the goodness of God. Now that's Dionysus. He's an Eastern Orthodox theologian. The Eastern Orthodox theologians love him. He became influential in the West beginning in the early Middle Ages, became very influential in the High Middle Ages in the 12th and 13th centuries. But he's rather different from Augustine, who's so influential in the West. And the West ends up having to combine the two in a peculiar way. So let me now contrast Dionysus, or Denis as the West calls him, with Augustine, who is the most influential theologian in the Western Church. Augustine, I think, conceives of God as intelligible. I should mention, I'm an Augustine scholar. That's my specialty. I did a course on Augustine, philosopher and saint for the Teaching Company many moons ago. And I have an unusual view of Augustine on this point, a controversial view at least. So you should be aware that there's a controversy brewing about this, and I'm on one side of it. What I think is that the best way to understand Augustine's view of God is to realize that Augustine thinks God is intelligible, that God can be seen by the mind's eye. It's as if when our diseased mind's eye is healed by grace, we can look straight at the sun and say, ah, yes, I see it now. We can look at the sun and not be dazzled. Augustine does talk a lot about the experience of being dazzled by the beauty and the truth of God, but he always attributes it to the failure of our mind's eye to be healthy and strong. Our mind's eye is like an eye, our intellect is like an eye designed to see the light of the sun. So our intellect is like an eye designed to see the light of divine truth. So of course we like looking straight at God. That's our happiness, is to look straight at the light of truth and beauty, the divine truth and beauty and goodness, and say, that's what I've been longing for all my life. That road that I've been traveling, that road of love, and I finally found the truth that I've been looking for, and I can look right at it. And that's what happiness is, to joy in the truth, says Augustine. So Augustine has a picture of God that fits more the picture of the divine mind in Plotinus than the picture of the one. Although, interestingly, Augustine really knows his Plotinus and knows his neo-paganism, or rather, pagan Neoplatonism. He knows the difference between pagan Neoplatonism and Christianity. And he does, in fact, when he talks about the Trinity, he'll use the language of the divine one, the incomprehensible and simple one. But he really doesn't have such a strong notion of incomprehensibility as Pseudo-Dionysius. For instance, he will say God is incomprehensible. He'll use that language. But he actually interprets it rather differently from Dionysius. Just like when he uses the metaphor of dazzlement. He's not saying, no, there's no created eye that can look at the sun. Right? You can't look at the sun. No, he's saying, if your eye is healthy, it can look at the sun. If your intellect, if your soul is healthy, it can grasp God. But with the eye of your soul unhealthy, you can't look at God without being dazzled. So you've got this unhealthy eye, but when the eye of the soul is healed by grace, and love brings you along that road to your heavenly home with God, you will, in fact, sort of by the very nature of your intellect, be able to see God. So Augustine, I think, is conceiving of our happiness and our goal in a rather different way from Dionysius. We're going to be able to see God with our mind's eye. That's what our mind's eye is made for. That's what our intellect is made for, is to see the truth. It is natural to us, we might say, to see God. And that's something that is unique to Augustine. It's fairly clear. The rest of the tradition doesn't want to say that. It's not natural to us to see God. Right? It's like the sun, that no natural eye can look at. So we've got a problem here that's going to have to be solved. But let me go on to say a little bit about Augustine's view of incomprehensibility. He does use the word, as I mentioned, but he doesn't interpret it as this dazzlement, as if God is inherently beyond our vision. Rather, he says this. Here's a sermon that he preaches, his 117th sermon. We got a lot of his sermons. He says this: God belongs to the mind. He is to be understood. That is, he is to be an object of intellect. The word understanding here is related to the word intellect in Latin. Intelligendus est. God pertains to the mind. He is to be understood by the intellect, just as bodies pertain to the eyes. They are to be seen by the eyes. But do you suppose you comprehend a body with your eyes? Not at all. Comprehend is a Latin term, it turns out, which means to grasp all around. A prehensile tail in a monkey is a grasping tail. To comprehend is to grasp all around. I can grasp a cup all around by putting my hands on both sides, and that's comprehending it in the literal sense. But can I see it from all sides? No. Whatever side I look at, there's a backside that I can't see. I cannot comprehend it with my sight. That's what Augustine means by saying that even visible objects are incomprehensible to sight. I can't see it all the way around. Likewise, he says in this sermon, whatever way you look at it, you're not looking at the whole thing. Same thing with God. You look at God, and indeed, God is there to be understood by the mind's eye. But you can't comprehend all of God. You can't grasp all of God with your intellectual vision. Well, sure, of course you can't grasp all of God with intellectual vision. I can't even grasp all of a cup with my literal vision. I can only look at one side of it. That's a very weak concept of incomprehensibility by comparison to Dionysius' concept. So, now we've got a problem. Fast forward into the Middle Ages in the West. The West is deeply influenced by Augustine. The West believes that it is our happiness to see God, just like Augustine taught. But on the other hand, the West has also inherited the theology of Pseudo-Dionysius, who was translated into Latin in the Middle Ages and became very influential. So what are you going to do if you're a medieval theologian in, say, the 13th century, like Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of all the medieval theologians, and you think that Augustine is right about our happiness. Happiness consists in seeing God with our mind's eye. That's the ultimate goal of life. On the other hand, you also believe with Dionysus that no created being can ever see the essence of God. The essence of God is beyond comprehension for any created intellect. How are you going to have happiness by seeing with your mind's eye an incomprehensible God? How are you going to put those two pictures together? That's the problem that Western medieval theologians had to face. And it's crucial because it's about happiness. And as you recall, happiness is the concept that gives you an account of the meaning of life. What is our life for? It's for happiness. It's for seeing God. But we can't see God without being dazzled. No created being can see God without being dazzled, says Dionysus. Augustine says we can, but that view gets dropped. The notion that it's natural for us to see God with our mind's eye is essentially rejected by both East and West. The notion that Augustine actually thinks we can, by nature, see God is a view of Augustine which I advocate is probably true about Augustine, but that's the controversial point in my own Augustine scholarship. So, let's go back to Thomas Aquinas, 13th century. How to say that we have a beatific vision of God, it's called, a vision of God that makes us happy. It's called beatific because it means gives us beatitude. Beatific is Latin for to give us happiness or beatitude. So that's what we need, is this vision of God that will make us happy, beatific vision. And yet he's incomprehensible. How do you combine this? Well, here's what Thomas Aquinas says. Like Dionysus, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century says that seeing God is beyond the natural capacity of any created being. Even the angels, by the way, cannot by nature see or understand God. God is incomprehensible even to the angels. Yet it is not beyond the capacity of a mind that is elevated by supernatural grace, says Thomas. This is a new concept of grace, a concept of grace which elevates human nature, and that's why it's called supernatural. It elevates it above itself so that it can see what no natural capacity is able to see. Grace, in this new sense, this new Thomistic or medieval Catholic sense, it's not in Augustine, I don't think. Grace in this new sense doesn't just help us to love God, doesn't just heal us so that our mind's eyes are strengthened to see God. No, it elevates us so that we can do what we cannot by nature do. That's what's supernatural about it. And it's a gift that sort of takes residence in our soul. Thomas will call it a habit. We'll talk about that notion a bit later. It's a habit in the sense that it forms our soul. It becomes a deep part of ourselves. Supernatural grace, it turns out, becomes, or is, in fact, a created thing. Supernatural grace is a created formation of our soul which lifts it up above its natural ability. So it's supernatural, but it's also created. That's an interesting combination of things. It's supernatural, but it's not divine, it's created. It's a created capacity, or rather created habit, formation of our soul, almost like a skill. A habit is like a skill in Aristotelian theology, Aristotelian philosophy, and Thomas is an Aristotelian. Think of how when you develop a habit like the ability to play the violin, that forms your heart and soul so you can do this well. Well, what supernatural grace does is it forms our heart and soul in this supernatural but created way, right? We're still just creatures here, so that our souls can see what is beyond their nature to see. It lifts up our nature so that it's still created nature, but beyond its natural inborn capacity, so that it has this supernatural ability to look right at the very essence of God, and instead of being dazzled, to find in that super brightness the beatitude, the happiness, the ultimate goal of human life. So, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, the greatest of all the medieval Catholic theologians and the most important theologian of the Roman Catholic Church, works on this new concept of grace, a grace that doesn't just heal or help the soul to love God, but elevates it. Not just healing and helping, but elevating, lifting us up above nature in this supernatural gift to see God and to find our happiness in seeing an incomprehensible God. The concept of the supernatural is Thomas's solution to the question, how do you combine Dionysius on the one hand and Augustine on the other? The West, in the 13th century, the Middle Ages, inherits these two theologians, and Thomas Aquinas, who's a very deep thinker, finds a way to combine the two. He's actually very good at taking different strands of the tradition and seeing how they can fit together. And that's what he's doing with this new concept of supernatural grace, which becomes a very, very important concept in Roman Catholic theology, which we will come back to in later lectures on Roman Catholic theology. But this is where it begins. This is the medieval development of really the patristic concept of the incomprehensibility of God. More medieval developments are on their way, developing ideas that go back to the Church Fathers and the New Testament. We're in the Middle Ages, more Middle Ages to come.